Peace everybody, Carol here, and I would like to use a simple blackboard and a piece of chalk to try to share for my journaling my proposed view of how unification can become a reality. Now, in 2004 to 2005, I began my work, which was mostly cerebral and on paper, calculations on paper, and it was a combination of using my PhD training in chemical engineering, in particular fluid dynamics, fluid mechanics. Heat and mass transfer was a good concept to have, and my understanding of engineering mathematics such as Laplace transform, Fourier transform, and other ways to transform information into other realms, which I like to call it, so that you can do the calculations more simply or visualize it better and then bring it back to the way we view it today. So I think the biggest hurdle has been to unify, Einstein's general theory of relativity with quantum mechanics. And to do that, I'm not going to use quantum mechanics or general theory of relativity per se. Like, I'm not going to use those languages. I've developed my own language, such as Aetheric Acceleration instead of warped space-time, because it presents a picture that's explaining the same thing, but it presents a picture that's easier for our layman's mind, our daily mind, our visceral experience of the reality to experience it. So just to start, the main point is that Einstein's thought experiment, where he claims that going through space and accelerating through space to where you're thrown back on the rocket ship floor, that feeling of force pushing you against the rocket floor is equivalent to standing on Earth. And all he's saying in my language is that ether, that is the zero-point field, is being sucked into the Earth because Earth, having a gravitational field, the nature of matter that is, sucks in ether. And so ether is accelerating downward, and I'm claiming, just like Einstein did, and it's nothing new, that that's equivalent to accelerating your massive body through the zero-point field in space. And the zero-point field, that's pretty much not debatable. I mean, it's a language that we've used, Hal Puthoff and others, to explain what the vacuum is. It's this infinite turbulence at very, very small scales of sort of an electromagnetic fluid, is the way they put it. Now, in reality, the electromagnetic word is actually a epiphenomenon of what's really going on. And ultimately, when you get down to the absolute truth of anything, there is no word for it. It's like, there's no word for God, there's no word for pure quiescent ether. That's why ancients called it the void. So that's like my starting point. And I'm going to use the term etheric flux. So we start with the premise that Earth, that's the easiest thing to understand because viscerally we live on Earth and we feel the force of gravity pushing us down on the surface every day, and we almost take it for granted. But what that is ether accelerating in to Earth. So that's the first point. Now, what I need to do to make unification a theory, a proposed theory, or at least a direction in which to begin, is to start, this is my view, to start with all the zero-point field around the Earth is going into the Earth. So let's make the Earth become smaller and smaller and smaller. In fact, let's just say we have a tiny particle. Well, the smallest particle that we're most familiar with would be the electron. And everyone knows what the electron is. It has a charge and so forth. Now, again, the charge is an epiphenomenon of what it actually is. So ultimately, I'm hypothesizing that everything in our universe can be explained by the flow of etheric flux. In fact, everything is made of some pattern of etheric flux. And because ether is connected, it's a fluid that's interconnected everywhere, and if you jiggle it in one place, the part as far away as you go somewhere else, is a mile or 20 million universes away, can feel it because it's a continuous fluid. So, so let's shrink the Earth down into an electron. Actually, that's not accurate. Let's just look at an electron and say, okay, that's like, let's just assume it's a point for now, and that space is going into it. And we have this very juvenile model of ether accelerating into it. And that means that the velocity is not up for discussion today. It's just the acceleration vector that identifies how fast the 0 point field is being forced. So it's like a force field that causes whatever's in its pathway to accelerate towards the Earth. And in fact, that's why a light wave is going to be bending towards the Earth and eventually fall in, because it has this force pushing it in caused by the Earth, or in this case, we're talking about a tiny electron that looks to us like a dot right now as human beings. So what happens then is that all of these, at the point, all the ether accelerating into it just disappears into a point, and that's called a mathematical singularity, because you can't really express that. What happens to it when it gets to the middle? So my first step in understanding this was to propose that it didn't go inward as a straight line, but it followed nature, and it went in a curved fashion. So far away, it looks like it's going into a straight line, but when you get close to that electron, it actually curves in, and that solves the singularity issue, because you don't have it going to a point anymore. You have it curving inward. So now I want to blow that diagram up even more. Let's magnify it even more to where we have. So I knew that it was going in somehow like this up close. But again, I didn't really know the structure. So I took a step back and said, well, we know that mass and light are interchangeable in terms of energy. And if you have a nuclear explosion, mass is converted into photons. So why don't we just look at photons and go, okay, what are photons? That seems more fundamental than mass, because mass is like a condensed photon, because it's a photon travels across space at the velocity of c, and an electron sits there. They both have energy, and if you take a gamma wave, a gamma photon that's of such high energy that it's like beyond X-ray, and even beyond. When we think of gamma, we think of it's even anything of a higher frequency than X-ray, I believe, is called a gamma wave. Well, this is a super high energy gamma wave, and you take that and you can magically make it transform into a circle using some equations that I developed, which is to talk about later. Then that becomes an electron. Except I calculated it backwards. I said if we have an electron, what frequency photon would be required to make that electron, and I calculated it to be the frequency equals a photon that's a gamma wave. But anyway, so that's just a little, I guess, trivia about the electron. But right now we're going to say, what is a light wave? Well, first of all, if you build a universe from scratch, you start with the void. All you have is space and nothingness and zilch. And if you ask the question, well, what if you had one something? What would that be? Like a little bubble of energy just right in the middle of that nothingness. Well, it turns out that anything you do to that nothingness, and I propose that nothingness is, we're going to, for practical purposes, call it, and again, this is a hypothetical thing, but it helps us think about it, is a fluid, like water or air or a plasma or honey, but very, very low viscosity. In fact, the limit of that fluid, as the viscosity approaches zero, that's what that fluid is. So that fluid has zero viscosity when it's quiescent and still. And it has, when you put a little tiny bit of energy into it, what would happen to a fluid of zero viscosity? It would have infinite turbulence. And so it would just start flowing in all directions. it might flow somewhat, and some might be in straight lines, but mostly, as you see in nature, you see curvature. So you get this curvature, and this agrees with Hal Puthoff, who proposes the zero-point field is a bunch of turbulence, like the way he puts it at the base of a waterfall. So this collective thought that's coming out in physics now, every time I come to a eureka, I look out there in the literature to see what's out there, and I noticed that Hal Puthoff proposed the same thing, and I guess other people have too. So we start out with that. Now, what happens when you have a three-dimensional zero viscosity fluid and you put in a little, God sneezes, for example, and you have a little bit of energy? So you get this infinite turbulence, and this is a 2D view, but in 3D you might get a spiral, right? That a spiraling fluid, like what you see when you burn incense, you'll have a spiral rising, or a tornado, you have a sort of a stable flow pattern. And without going into the detail right now, because I want to get further along than that on this talk, that flow of ether in a spiral pattern that's a vortex is a photon of light. And so I have a qualitative model for light right now, and I can draw like a plot of the energy density. It's real high and then it falls off, but I'm not going to go to that right now. I'm just saying that, so if we can just pretend along with me, just go along with me that a photon of light is a vortex, and we're gonna say that the spiraling nature of that vortex has to be a golden spiral for reasons that are not going to be talked about right this second, but I'm just saying that's the model. So we're going to take that photon and we're going to draw it like kind of like a triangle, just to make it, because it has a tip, and that's where all the flow goes, and all the universe is involved in that photon. The photon has an etheric flux vector field, or an etheric acceleration vector field in 3D that expresses its flow, and every point in the universe belongs to that photon's etheric acceleration vector field. Okay? And so every point has like the x direction, the y direction, and the z direction of the acceleration vector that acts on whatever's in its path, whether it's the void or whether it's a bunch of other miniature whorls and swirls in the universe that actually have a finite inertia. It's smaller than we can imagine, and none of our instruments could ever pick it up because it's even below Planck's length, but it's a fractally nested turbulence. So that's what we start with for the photon. Now, why am I like just trying to get through this? Because I want to propose the photon is a vortex that has a directionality into its flow. Okay, so there's sort of a spiral showing the vortex in 3D, and then there's like the tip. Okay, and it goes at the speed of c because of the density of the zero-point field. And if you notice that light waves do slow down when the zero-point field is more dense, such as between the interstices in galaxies where there's a lot more action going on. But when you're out in the middle of nowhere and there's no galaxies around, the light will speed up because there's less resistance to its flow. So point being is, this is what goes into an electron. But how can this straight line moving object become an electron? Well, it's got a clockwise flow. That is the zero-point entities which are being formed, and they may be temporary particles that pop into and out of existence, but they still have inertia while they're there. And when they disappear, new ones will form. So there's always going to be a nice collection of inertia-containing particles in the zero-point field at any point that will be sucked into this photon and give it sort of a gyroscopic stability and an inertial torque, an inertial angular momentum, and that's what defines the photon, and that's why it has an energy. So So we can think of it as a tube for purposes of, in other words, we transform this reality to a simpler reality in the same way that you might transform a complicated function using a Laplace transform into a simpler function so that you can then do the math. So we're going to transform this into sort of a tube with a handedness, and we're going to say that this tube, okay, that's the photon that has a handedness, somehow is formed into a circular tube. How can that be? Well, because of general theory of relativity, we know that all entities of energy suck in ether. Ether accelerates into it, and that so that the ether creates it, and it creates the ether flowing into it. It's a co-creation. So this flow of ether that accelerates and makes the tube of light and has momentum and has a handedness, when formed into a tube, you can calculate the diameter of the tube by saying, not unlike the geon proposed by Wilhelm, that the tail is much more strongly sucking in the head is much more strongly sucking in of ether than the tail, but they're both sucking in. And if you superimpose the head on the tail, as in this bagel representation, you can calculate this stable diameter of that stable entity in which the head and the tail suck each other in, this Ouroboros, the snake swallowing its tail, and you get a toroidal shape of etheric flow that flows from infinity into it. It spirals, it goes in, and it spirals along that path. Spirals along the path of the donut and goes around and around and around and around forever and ever. And that is our electron. And the reason it has gravity, and it seems like it goes into a single point, is it really goes into the toroidal shape out here. This is like, say, a little particle. Say this is fairly long lasting. It goes in, it's sucked in to this entity, and it flows around, it flows around, flows around, flows around, and then it follows, and then it gets smaller and smaller in terms of its diameter flowing, and then it just keeps going around like that forever and ever. So therefore this electron will always be sucking in ether forever and ever until you uncircularify it, until you break it open. So if you can have a three-dimensional etheric flux, well, I'll just call it etheric acceleration vector field that describes this electron, it's not a simple thing, but conceptually it's simple if you understand that the vortex that goes in to form it, and you understand that math, is that math bent around in a circle. So that would, perhaps you could say that would be yet another transformation. You transform reality into the vortex form. You assume it starts out as the visceral void and then becomes the 0-point field. And then upon that you superimpose the light wave, and then you superimpose that light wave's head upon its tail, and then you find that the electron has a certain net flux of ether that flows into it, which is its gravity. So gravity and etheric flux are equivalent. But I'm not calling it gravity anymore. I'm calling it etheric flux because it's the void of ether that flows inward and takes with it whatever's in its path. And the 0-point field is in its path because of all the turbulence there. So that's our electron. Now, I want to go back to light because my first model of light was just the ether flowing like this in a straight line, but then I realized it has to spiral, and it has to be a golden spiral. In other words, if you're looking down on it, it'll go into the light as a golden spiral. That is the etheric vector field. Will look like a spiral pattern. Now, now we have a vortex, like a tornado. But what does it really do? Well, if you look at tornadoes in nature, here's the sky, and the tornado comes down, and it kind of wiggles like that. And all vortices have sort of a secondary wiggle. And then on top of that, they could have a tertiary wiggle, so that they wiggle, and then they wiggle bigger. You know, so there's lots of wiggle patterns that can be formed on this light wave. And the clockwise light wave can have a clockwise wiggle, or perhaps a counterclockwise wiggle. So all of these characteristics of the light wave can now be proposed by me now to you to consider as elementary entities that form into mass entities. And the realms that we talk about when we talk about people communicating with beings of other realms, those entities can be intelligent, information exchanging entities that only are formed from light and other non-mass shapes. And by non-mass, I mean we define mass as anything condensed that stays still long enough for us to measure it, that our instruments can measure as heavy. And that's what we call mass. But there's probably a lot of life forms that are made of everything but that, or other subsets of entities in our universe that are somewhat stable in terms of lasting over periods of time. And mass lasts long periods of time. Unstable mass radioactively decays, but the mass in our bodies lasts at least a lifetime, which is what gives us our structure. So that's really what I wanted to say for this video, and this is June 28th, 2019 on a Saturday, a beautiful day. It's a holiday weekend in BC, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. And if you have any comments or would like to add anything, I would love to hear your comments. Again, this is just the beginning of some of my chronicles. I'm going to make these very, very informal. I might put some text in the white space in order to make it a little bit more, I guess, complete. And this way I won't be taking so long to post my ideas, because I've been being a little bit too much of a perfectionist lately, and as a result my ideas are building up, but I'm not getting them recorded in a formal way. So this is my first attempt to do that. So I hope this works, and I hope you don't mind if I'm a little bit dressed informally. It's a very hot day in BC. We don't have air conditioning in most buildings. So peace, everybody.